Two of Hollywood's biggest titans standing face to face in a dimly lit parking lot, fists clenched, rage burning in their eyes. Kirk Douglas, the intense method actor known for his explosive temper, had just challenged Dean Martin, the cool-as-ice crooner of the Rat Pack, to a fistfight. The entire film crew had scattered, knowing that when these two collided, something had to give. But what happened next in that parking lot wasn't a brawl that would make headlines. It was something far more powerful. It was a moment of raw vulnerability that would change both men forever and teach Hollywood a lesson about what real strength actually means. Stay with me, because what Dean Martin revealed to Kirk Douglas that night will shake everything you thought you knew about these legends. It was October 1958 in Madison, Indiana. The small Midwestern town had been transformed into a bustling movie set for Some Came Running, a gritty drama that would go on to become one of the most acclaimed films of the era. Frank Sinatra starred as the lead, a disillusioned war veteran and failed writer returning to his hometown. Dean Martin played his charming, gambling sidekick, and Shirley MacLaine brought vulnerability to the role of a naive, good-time girl. The film was directed by the legendary Vincente Minnelli, and expectations were sky-high. But behind the scenes, tension was building like a pressure cooker about to explode. Kirk Douglas wasn't even in Some Came Running, but he was there. He was visiting the set, observing, watching, analyzing. You see, Kirk Douglas was the kind of actor who studied everything obsessively. Born Isser Danilovich Dembski in 1916 to Russian Jewish immigrants, Kirk had clawed his way up from absolute poverty in upstate New York. His father was a ragman, collecting junk from a horse-drawn cart, barely making enough to feed 7 children. Kirk knew what hunger felt like, both literally and metaphorically. That hunger never left him. It became the fuel for his explosive intensity on screen and his demanding perfectionism off-screen. By 1958, Kirk Douglas had established himself as one of Hollywood's most respected actors. He delivered powerhouse performances in Champion, Ace in the Hole, The Bad and the Beautiful, Lust for Life, and Paths of Glory. Critics praised his raw emotional power, his ability to convey rage, ambition, vulnerability, and complexity all at once. But that intensity came at a cost. Kirk was known in Hollywood as difficult, demanding, and relentless. He pushed directors, challenged fellow actors, and refused to compromise his vision of what a performance should be. Some called him a perfectionist. Others called him impossible to work with. Kirk Douglas believed in method acting before method acting became fashionable. He immersed himself completely in every role, living and breathing his characters. He demanded the same level of commitment from everyone around him. If you were going to act opposite Kirk Douglas, you better bring your A game, or he would let you know about it. And he wouldn't be subtle. Now contrast that with Dean Martin. Born Dino Paul Crocetti in 1917 in Steubenville, Ohio, to Italian immigrant parents, Dean came from similar working-class roots. But where Kirk channeled his struggles into fierce intensity, Dean developed a completely different survival strategy. He became cool. Not just cool in the superficial sense, but genuinely, authentically unflappable. Dean Martin was the king of cool long before anyone coined the term. He learned early that the best way to navigate life's difficulties was to never let them see you sweat, never let them see you care too much, and always keep your dignity intact by maintaining that smooth, easygoing exterior. By 1958, Dean Martin was transitioning from his legendary comedy partnership with Jerry Lewis into a solo career that would define him as one of the greatest entertainers of the 20th century. He could sing, he could act, he could charm an audience with seemingly zero effort. He was about to become a core member of the Rat Pack alongside Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. But Dean was different from the others. While Sinatra was fiery and passionate, while Sammy was electrifying and dynamic, Dean maintained that laid-back, sardonic, couldn't-care-less persona that made him magnetic. Dean Martin had also been an amateur boxer in his youth, fighting under the name Kid Crochet. He had massive hands and knew how to use them. But Dean didn't go around advertising his toughness. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. That was the essence of Dean Martin. Quiet confidence, unshakable self-possession, and a refusal to engage in unnecessary drama. So when Kirk Douglas showed up on the set of Some Came Running and started watching the production, these two fundamentally different philosophies of life and art were bound to collide. For 3 weeks, Kirk watched. And for 3 weeks, Kirk seethed. From his perspective, what he witnessed was an absolute travesty. He saw Dean Martin strolling onto set whenever he felt like it, often late. He saw Dean doing minimal preparation, rarely rehearsing, seemingly not taking the craft seriously. He saw Dean joking around between takes, maintaining that casual, carefree attitude that Kirk interpreted as laziness and disrespect for the art form. To Kirk Douglas, acting was sacred. It was the culmination of blood, sweat, tears, and absolute commitment. To see someone treating it like it was no big deal was, in Kirk's mind, an insult to every serious actor who had ever lived. What Kirk didn't understand, what he couldn't see from his outside observer's position, was that Dean Martin's approach was just as valid, just as professional, and just as effective as his own. Dean didn't need to agonize over every line reading because he had an instinctive understanding of character and timing. He didn't need to isolate himself and brood because he could access authentic emotion without torturing himself. Dean's genius was in making the incredibly difficult look effortlessly easy. That's a skill, not a lack of skill. But Kirk couldn't see it that way. Kirk also noticed something else that bothered him deeply. He saw how the crew responded to Dean. They loved him. They laughed at his jokes. They appreciated his kindness. They enjoyed working with him because he created a relaxed, pleasant atmosphere on set. And this, perhaps more than anything, infuriated Kirk. Kirk commanded respect through intensity and excellence, but he wasn't necessarily liked. Dean was both respected and adored, and he achieved it without breaking a sweat. To Kirk's hyper-competitive mindset, this felt fundamentally unfair. On the 21st day of shooting, something inside Kirk Douglas snapped. He'd been holding his tongue, watching what he considered unprofessional behavior, and he couldn't contain himself any longer. After Dean finished a scene, and the director called cut, Kirk walked directly up to him. The crew immediately sensed trouble. Kirk Douglas approaching anyone with that particular look on his face was never a good sign. Kirk started questioning Dean's commitment to the craft. His voice was controlled at first, but the accusation in his words was unmistakable. He suggested that Dean was coasting, that he wasn't giving the material the respect it deserved, that he was relying on charm instead of actual acting. These weren't suggestions, really. They were indictments. And Kirk delivered them in front of cast and crew members who had stopped what they were doing to watch this confrontation unfold. Dean Martin's response was initially what you'd expect: cool, dismissive, refusing to engage. He made a joke, tried to deflect, attempted to keep things light. But Kirk wouldn't let it go. He pressed harder, his voice rising, his criticism becoming more pointed and more personal. He called Dean's approach lazy. He questioned whether Dean even understood what real acting required. He suggested that Dean was getting by on personality rather than talent. For most of the crew, watching Kirk Douglas publicly tear into Dean Martin was uncomfortable, shocking, and completely out of line. But it was also fascinating in a train wreck sort of way. Here were two of Hollywood's biggest personalities, representing completely opposite approaches to their craft, finally having the confrontation that had been building beneath the surface. Dean's smile faded. His eyes went cold. And in a voice that was quiet but carried absolute authority, Dean said something along the lines of, "You want to settle this? Fine. Let's settle it. Parking lot. 5 minutes." Then he turned and walked away. The entire set went silent. Dean Martin, the laid-back crooner who never got ruffled, had just accepted a challenge to a fistfight from Kirk Douglas, one of the most intense and physically imposing actors in Hollywood. This wasn't Hollywood dramatics or scripted conflict. This was two grown men with decades of pent-up pride, ego, and fundamentally different worldviews about to throw hands in a parking lot. Word spread through the crew like wildfire. People whispered nervously. Some tried to find Frank Sinatra or the director, hoping someone could intervene. Others quietly made their way toward the parking lot, morbidly curious to see what would happen when these two titans collided. Everyone knew this was serious. Dean Martin didn't bluff. Kirk Douglas didn't back down from anything. This was really going to happen. Kirk Douglas stormed the parking lot first, his jaw clenched, his entire body radiating fury. He'd been challenged, and there was no way he would refuse. His pride wouldn't allow it. His entire self-image as a tough, uncompromising man was on the line. He paced in the gravel parking area, fists opening and closing, adrenaline pumping through his system, ready for whatever came next. Dean Martin took his time. He didn't rush. He didn't storm. He walked to the parking lot with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything in his life. When he arrived, the two men stood about 15 feet apart. The autumn Indiana evening was cool, the sun setting behind the small-town buildings, casting long shadows across the lot. It was the kind of cinematic moment that would have been perfect for one of their movies, except this was real, and the consequences were real. Kirk spoke first. His voice was sharp, challenging, daring Dean to make the first move. Dean just looked at him, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a move that nobody expected, Dean's expression changed. The hardness in his eyes softened. His shoulders dropped slightly. And he did something that Kirk Douglas absolutely did not anticipate. He got vulnerable. Dean started talking. Not with anger or defensiveness, but with raw, honest emotion that he usually kept hidden beneath layers of cool detachment. He talked about growing up poor, about being made fun of for his Italian heritage, about dropping out of school in the 10th grade because his family needed money. He talked about working in a steel mill, dealing cards in illegal gambling houses, and boxing in smoky backroom fights where men bet on which kid would bleed first. He talked about being told he wasn't smart enough, wasn't American enough, wasn't refined enough to ever make something of himself. Dean talked about partnering with Jerry Lewis and becoming one half of the most successful comedy team in history, only to be treated as the lesser half, the straight man, the one who wasn't really the star. He talked about what it felt like to be constantly underestimated, constantly assumed to be riding on someone else's coattails. He talked about the dissolution of that partnership and the terrifying prospect of having to prove himself all over again as a solo performer. He talked about the fear that maybe everyone was right, maybe he wasn't good enough, maybe he didn't have what it took to stand on his own. And then Dean talked about his approach to acting. He explained that he didn't show up late because he didn't care. He showed up when he did because he'd already done his work privately, on his own terms, in his own way. He explained that he didn't rehearse obsessively in front of everyone because he'd already rehearsed obsessively in his head, working through characters and emotional beats in the quiet solitude of his hotel room. He explained that his casual demeanor on set wasn't disrespect. It was his way of keeping anxiety at bay, of creating an environment where he could access genuine emotion without being paralyzed by the pressure of being watched and judged constantly. Dean told Kirk something that stopped him cold. "You think I don't care about the work? The work is all I have. But I learned a long time ago that if I show everyone how much I care, if I let them see me sweat, if I let them see me desperate and hungry and afraid, they'll use it against me. They'll smell weakness, and they'll tear me apart. So I smile. I joke. I act like none of it matters. Because that's how I survive. That's how I protect myself. But don't you dare tell me I don't care." Kirk Douglas stood there, fists still clenched, but something fundamental was shifting inside him. Here was Dean Martin, this man he judged as superficial and uncommitted, revealing depths of struggle, fear, and determination that mirrored Kirk's own. Dean wasn't lazy or unprofessional. He was employing a different survival strategy, one born from different circumstances and different wounds, but no less valid than Kirk's approach. Dean continued. He talked about respect. He said that respect isn't earned by tearing others down or by proving you're tougher, more intense, or more committed than everyone around you. Respect is earned by doing your work with integrity, treating people with decency, and recognizing that everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about. He told Kirk that his intensity was admirable, but it didn't give him the right to judge how other people approached their craft. And then Dean said something that would echo in Kirk Douglas's mind for the rest of his life. "You want to fight me to prove you're tough? Fine. I'll fight you. I've fought plenty. But what's that going to prove? That you can throw a punch? That you can win a fight? Real toughness isn't about being willing to fight. Real toughness is being willing to be vulnerable, to admit when you're scared, to show people who you really are beneath all the armor. That's the hardest thing any of us can do. And most of us are too afraid to even try. Kirk Douglas felt something crack inside him. His anger drained away, replaced by something he wasn't quite prepared for: shame. Not shame for being confronted, but shame for being so blind, so judgmental, so quick to assume the worst about someone whose shoes he'd never walked in. Kirk had spent his entire life proving he was tough enough, smart enough, talented enough to belong in a world that had tried to keep him out. And in doing so, he'd become the very thing he hated: someone who judged others without understanding their journey. Kirk's fists unclenched. His shoulders dropped. And he did something that was incredibly difficult for a man of his pride and intensity. He apologized. Not a half-hearted, defensive apology, but a genuine acknowledgement that he'd been wrong. He told Dean that he'd judged him unfairly, that he'd let his own insecurities and his rigid ideas about what commitment looks like cloud his judgment. He admitted that he'd been so focused on his own way of doing things that he'd dismissed any approach that didn't match his own. Dean accepted the apology with a nod. He didn't gloat, didn't rub it in, didn't make Kirk grovel. He just accepted it with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. And then he extended his hand. Kirk looked at that hand for a moment, then grasped it firmly. They stood there in that parking lot, two men who moments before were ready to tear each other apart, now connected by something deeper than either of them expected: mutual understanding and respect. They talked for another hour in that parking lot. Not about fighting, not about acting techniques, but about life. They talked about their immigrant parents, about growing up poor, about the hunger that drove them, about the fear of failure that never really goes away no matter how successful you become. They talked about the masks they wore: Kirk's mask of intensity and Dean's mask of cool detachment, and how exhausting it is to maintain those masks constantly. They talked about the cost of fame, the isolation that comes with success, and the strange paradox of being surrounded by people all the time, yet feeling profoundly alone. What happened in that parking lot was a moment of genuine human connection between two men who had spent their lives guarding themselves against exactly that kind of vulnerability. Hollywood was not a place that rewarded emotional openness, especially not for men at their level of fame and power. But somehow, in that confrontation that should have ended in violence, they found something more valuable: the courage to be seen. By the time they walked back to the set together, something had fundamentally changed. The crew noticed it immediately. Kirk and Dean weren't friends exactly, not in the way Frank Sinatra and Dean were friends, but there was a respect and understanding between them that hadn't existed before. Kirk stopped judging Dean's process. Dean stopped assuming Kirk's intensity was meant as an attack on everyone else's approach. The incident in the parking lot became something of a legend in Hollywood, though the details were usually distorted. Most versions of the story focused on the near fight, on the macho posturing, on two tough guys almost coming to blows. But the people who were actually there, the crew members who witnessed the confrontation and its aftermath, knew the truth. They knew that what actually happened was far more powerful and important than any fight could have been. This moment changed Kirk Douglas in ways that would ripple through the rest of his career. He became more thoughtful about how he interacted with fellow actors. He didn't lose his intensity, that would never happen, but he became more willing to consider that different approaches could be equally valid. He became more interested in understanding rather than judging. Years later, in his autobiography, The Ragman's Son, Kirk would write extensively about his own flaws and struggles, displaying a level of self-awareness and vulnerability that he'd spent most of his career avoiding. That willingness to be honest about his imperfections, to admit his mistakes and confront his demons, can be traced back to that night in a parking lot in Madison, Indiana, when Dean Martin taught him what real toughness looks like. For Dean Martin, the incident reaffirmed something he'd always known but rarely articulated: that his way of moving through the world was valid, that he didn't need to become someone else to be respected, that his laid-back cool wasn't a weakness, but a strength. Dean would go on to become one of the most beloved figures in entertainment history, starring in countless films, hosting his own television variety show, headlining in Las Vegas, and becoming synonymous with effortless class and charm. But those who knew him well understood that beneath that cool exterior was a man of profound depth, loyalty, and integrity. The fact that he chose not to broadcast those qualities to the world didn't make them any less real. The story of Kirk Douglas and Dean Martin's parking lot confrontation is a story about ego, pride, and the walls we build to protect ourselves. It's about the danger of judging others based on limited information and our own biases. It's about the courage required to admit when you're wrong and the grace required to accept that admission without humiliation. Most importantly, it's about the unexpected places where we find wisdom and growth. In Hollywood's golden age, the prevailing culture was one of machismo, competition, and carefully maintained images. Men, especially powerful men, were expected to project strength at all times. Vulnerability was seen as weakness. Emotional honesty was seen as unprofessional. The idea that two alpha males would stand in a parking lot and talk honestly about their fears, their insecurities, and their struggles was almost unthinkable. That's why this moment was so revolutionary, even though it happened privately and wasn't widely publicized in its true form. What Kirk learned from Dean that night was that there are many ways to be strong. Kirk's strength had always been in his visible intensity, his willingness to burn hot and bright, to put everything on the line and dare the world to keep up with him. Dean's strength was quieter but no less powerful, the ability to maintain his center, to stay grounded and balanced, to navigate challenges without losing his cool. Both approaches had value. Both required tremendous courage and discipline. Neither was inherently superior to the other. This lesson extended beyond acting. It touched on fundamental questions about masculinity, success, and what it means to live with integrity. The 1950s were a time when American culture had very rigid ideas about how men should behave, especially successful men. You were supposed to be tough, stoic, competitive, and emotionally restrained. The idea that vulnerability could be a strength, that admitting fear could be brave, that showing emotion could be powerful, these concepts were largely foreign to mainstream American masculinity. Kirk Douglas and Dean Martin, in their own ways, were both products of and rebels against that culture. Kirk rebelled by being too intense, too emotional, too willing to show rage and ambition and hunger. Dean rebelled by refusing to take anything too seriously, by maintaining an ironic distance from the game even while playing it brilliantly. Both men paid a price for their respective rebellions. Kirk was often seen as difficult and exhausting. Dean was often seen as lightweight and superficial. Neither assessment was accurate, but both stuck because they confirmed cultural biases. The parking lot confrontation forced both men to see past their own biases and recognize each other's full humanity. In doing so, they created a moment of genuine brotherhood that transcended their differences. This is the part of the story that gets lost in most retellings. People love the drama of the near fight, the image of two Hollywood legends ready to brawl. But the real story, the meaningful story, is what happened when they chose not to fight. That choice required more courage than any physical confrontation could have. Think about what Dean Martin did in that moment. He was challenged to a fight by Kirk Douglas, a man who was physically intimidating and known for his toughness. Dean could have responded with matching aggression. He could have tried to out-tough Kirk, to prove his masculinity through violence. Instead, he chose a completely different path. He chose emotional honesty. He chose to drop his armor and reveal the person beneath the cool facade. That's an incredibly risky move. It requires trust that the other person won't weaponize your vulnerability against you. It requires faith that honesty will be met with respect rather than mockery. And think about what Kirk Douglas did in response. He was in a full rage, ready for a fight, convinced he was in the right. Dean's vulnerability could have been seen as weakness, as confirmation that Kirk was tougher and more committed. Kirk could have doubled down, pressed his advantage, made Dean's openness into a victory for himself. Instead, he listened. He let Dean's words penetrate his anger. He allowed himself to be changed by what he heard. That requires tremendous humility and self-awareness. It requires the willingness to admit you might be wrong, that your perspective might be limited, that you might have something to learn from someone you dismissed. Both men made choices in that parking lot that went against every instinct their competitive, macho culture had instilled in them. And both men walked away from that parking lot better, wiser, more complete than they'd been walking into it. The friendship that developed between Kirk Douglas and Dean Martin after that night was never highly publicized. They didn't become best friends or constant companions. They moved in different social circles, Dean with the Rat Pack and Kirk with his own group of intense, politically engaged artists. But there was a bond between them that those who knew them recognized. They had seen each other, really seen each other, in a way that few people in Hollywood ever did. That kind of mutual recognition creates a connection that doesn't fade. In later years, Kirk Douglas would speak about the importance of vulnerability in his work and his life. He became an advocate for mental health awareness long before it was fashionable in Hollywood. He wrote openly about his struggles with depression, his complicated relationship with his father, his infidelities, and the pain they caused his family. This level of honesty was unusual for a Hollywood star of his generation, especially one known for playing tough, uncompromising characters. It's impossible to say definitively where that willingness to be vulnerable came from, but it's hard not to trace a line back to that October night in Indiana when Dean Martin showed him what emotional courage looks like. Dean Martin, for his part, continued to be Dean Martin. Cool, funny, talented, and seemingly effortless in everything he did. But those close to him knew the truth. His daughter Deanna Martin has spoken about her father's depth, his kindness, his loyalty, and the deep sadness he carried, especially after the death of his son Dean Paul Martin in 1987. Dean never became someone who wore his emotions on his sleeve. That wasn't who he was. But the people he let inside his circle knew they had access to something rare and precious, the real Dean Martin, the man beneath the persona, the person who felt everything deeply but chose to express it quietly. The story of these two men teaches us something vital about judgment and understanding. How often do we look at someone's external behavior and assume we know what it means? How often do we judge people based on our own limited perspective, our own biases, our own insecurities? Kirk Douglas looked at Dean Martin and saw laziness because Dean's approach didn't match his own. He assumed that because Dean made it look easy, it must be easy, and therefore less worthy of respect. He couldn't imagine that Dean's ease was hard-won, that it took tremendous skill and self-mastery to perform at that level while appearing relaxed. This is a trap we all fall into. We assume that our way of doing things is the right way, the best way, the only valid way. We dismiss approaches that differ from ours as inferior, misguided, or lazy. We fail to recognize that people's external presentations often mask complex internal realities. The driven, intense person might be running from their own demons. The laid-back, easygoing person might be exercising tremendous self-control to maintain that appearance. The loud person might be desperate for connection. The quiet person might be observing everything with profound insight. We rarely know the full story, yet we judge constantly based on the limited information we have. What Kirk Douglas learned in that parking lot is what we all need to learn. Suspend judgment, seek understanding, recognize that everyone's fighting battles we know nothing about. This doesn't mean we can't have standards or expectations. It doesn't mean all approaches are equally effective in all contexts. But it does mean we should be humble about our assessments and curious about perspectives that differ from our own. The entertainment industry today is vastly different from what it was in 1958, but some dynamics remain the same. There are still intense, driven perfectionists who push themselves and everyone around them relentlessly. There are still cool, effortless performers who make everything look easy. There are still conflicts between different artistic philosophies, different work styles, different visions of what excellence looks like. The names and faces change, but the fundamental human dynamics persist. What we need more of in Hollywood and everywhere else are moments like the one Kirk Douglas and Dean Martin shared in that parking lot. Moments where the armor comes off, where people speak honestly about their struggles and fears, where vulnerability is met with respect rather than exploitation. Moments where we choose understanding over judgment, connection over competition, growth over ego protection. The tragedy is that these moments are rare. Most conflicts don't end with breakthrough conversations and mutual respect. Most confrontations escalate rather than resolve. Most people protect their egos rather than risk vulnerability. Most opportunities for genuine connection are lost because we're too afraid, too proud, or too convinced of our own righteousness to take the risk. But the beauty is that these moments are possible. Kirk and Dean proved it. Two men from similar backgrounds with similar struggles who had constructed completely different defense mechanisms and life strategies found common ground. They didn't have to become the same person. Kirk didn't have to become laid back, and Dean didn't have to become intense. They just had to recognize and respect each other's full humanity. That recognition transformed a potentially destructive situation into something constructive and meaningful. This is the real lesson of the parking lot confrontation. Not that fighting is bad, though that's certainly true. Not that you should always back down from conflict, because sometimes conflict is necessary and important. The lesson is that the strongest position you can take is one of open, honest, vulnerable communication. When you drop your defenses and speak your truth, you give the other person permission to do the same. And in that mutual vulnerability, transformation becomes possible. Kirk Douglas lived to be 103 years old, passing away in 2020. Dean Martin lived to be 78, passing in 1995. Both men left behind extraordinary legacies in film, television, and music. Both influenced countless performers who came after them. Both are remembered as icons of Hollywood's golden age. But for those who know the full story, they're also remembered for something else. For the night they almost came to blows and instead found brotherhood. For the moment when two tough guys discovered that real toughness isn't about winning fights or proving dominance. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to admit when you're wrong, and the grace to see the full humanity in people who seem different from you. That parking lot in Madison, Indiana, was just a small patch of gravel behind a film set. But what happened there was monumental. It was a lesson about masculinity, about respect, about the many different ways people protect themselves and pursue excellence. It was a reminder that beneath our differences, our defenses, and our carefully constructed personas, we're all just human beings trying to make it through this world with our dignity intact. And sometimes, just sometimes, when we have the courage to drop those defenses and show each other who we really are, we find that we're not so different after all. Kirk Douglas challenged Dean Martin to a fistfight. What happened in that parking lot changed both men. It changed their understanding of themselves, of each other, and of what it means to be truly strong. And if we're willing to listen, it can change us too.